2 or 3 up!
These bodies, they're stacked up like...
Being a Marine is something I'm really proud of, but I see the psychological impact that I come to the table a little bit broken.
I was 19 and I had to mentally prepare myself to die.
My soldier got into an argument with his wife, went in the bedroom, locked her out, and shot himself in the head.
People fell through the cracks, Marines committed suicide, and all that, much of that could have been possibly prevented.
There has to be as much thought about returning to society as there is about sending to war.
We use psychology to develop ways to efficiently train people how to kill. We haven't applied that same research and emphasis on how to help people kind of best deprogram that.
My father was a Marine. He was a combat veteran, both in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. I have 2 adult sons, both who were in the wars in Afghanistan, and I have an adult daughter who is now deployed. So I'm a son of a veteran, and I am a father of veterans. As a military psychologist, I was deployed at the outset of the Iraq invasion in 2003, so I was part of a field hospital that provided neuropsychiatric services to people coming off the battlefield. Right before the deployment, we had a field hospital training where we're simulating receiving casualties in a war zone scenario. So there's a lot of bombs bursting in the air. People are coming in on stretchers and helicopters are bringing in casualties. I was the head of a neuropsychiatry division, and we're all ready for our first simulated casualty. And it was about an hour into the exercise, and we never got a call. We're just literally sitting around. About another hour into it, we get our call. Our only simulated psychiatric casualty for that exercise was somebody who was feigning to be Batgirl. So we're really not training like this is serious. We arrive and we set up the field hospital. Myself and all the other department heads are gathered together in an open field, and our chief medical officer is on top of a wooden box, and he's got a clipboard, and he's reading out what are the departments. Ultimately, every name was called except for mental health. And when I asked, well, what about mental health? And he looked at his clipboard and said, well, there's nothing in here about mental health. You can just pull up some chairs in one of the wards, and that'll be where mental health will set up shop. I wasn't satisfied with that. So I came up with the plan that we're going to screen all the medical evacuees coming off the battlefields of Iraq and try to proactively identify which folks might need more follow-up when they go on to the stateside. Also, we're going to do some post-deployment debriefings because these individuals separated from their units, we're going to get a debriefing on and what to expect when you get back.
With, life-altering events, when they come back, their behavior is going to be changed.
This person that's here isn't the person that you started out with.
We know now exactly what happens to the brain.
I went into the VA for the first time and I cried. I had depression, I had anxiety, I had insomnia.
I've had some combat veterans that will say, oh, I haven't slept in 20 years. I mean, that feeling of being on all the time or slightly agitated. And the costs of divorce, separations, loss of work. This is a costly fight, and it's not just PTSD.
No one talks about the families of the veterans. They're the ones that will stick with them the rest of their lives. And a very simple kind of is that the VA does not see families. They can only see individuals. And yet the primary source of support is within the family.
There's a lot of resources available to some of our male vets, shelters, homeless shelters, rehab programs, transitional housing, help at the VA, that aren't available to moms with kids. There's a lot of moms living in their cars. There's a lot of moms that are just making do, and a lot of moms staying in situations that aren't ideal.
One of the things I did right after the Iraq invasion in my deployment is I went and surveyed 133 military mental health providers. See, people like me who wore uniforms, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, who are the experts, right? The subject matter experts you would expect. I was just asking how many had been trained specifically on how to diagnose and treat PTSD. 90% had not received specific training. So, you go to war with people who aren't trained, even how to recognize and treat. The most common of a psychological condition would be like going to war without surgeons who never had been trained on how to dress a battle wound or repair human physical damage.
2006, there was an article. It was definitive evidence to show that you should never send someone who has PTSD back into combat. We've known this for a long time, and particularly in terms of that systematic review. And yet we did it.
The policy of frontline psychiatry is to preserve the fighting force, to return to duty as many as we can. The only time these people get sent back home, out of the war zone, is if there's really no hope for them to be returned back to duty.
Well, I have an active duty son, so he's deployed right now, probably somewhere in the Middle East, though we don't know where, because he's operational security. It's just very emotional to see all the pain and suffering that has been caused by the failure of the military to provide adequate mental health care for its people. It's an outrage.
We have 3 separate organizations, 3 different chain of commands, 3 different leadership structures and funding sources that provide mental health care in the military. So there's not a single agency or leader that's accountable for overseeing the entire mental health. We don't do that with medicine, we don't do that with dental, we don't do that with any other aspect of military health care, but with mental health, we got this inherently fragmented system. When I was stationed in Iwakuni, Japan, a Marine Corps base in a rural part of Japan of 6,000 Marines, I was the only credentialed uniform mental health provider on that base, not only for the Marines, but for all their family members and for 2 other bases in Japan. On this base, there were 6 other licensed mental health providers who were fully credentialed, but because they didn't belong to military medicine, they're prohibited by instruction to see people who were depressed or had PTSD or who were suicidal. And by their policies, they had to refer them to me, to that 3-month waiting list. People fell through the cracks, Marines committed suicide, and all that, much of that could have been possibly prevented. I began to speak up, and I was asked repeatedly by folks at the headquarters level to produce reports and to provide my analysis of what the problems are in military mental health care and what the solutions might be. I was asked by the Navy Surgeon General to write a point paper for him specific to what are the things that are needed to avert a mental health crisis. That included not only the training needs, but also issues around stigma, providing support to families, ensuring people got treatment before they left the military. As a result, I was given a Meritorious Service Medal by President Bush. It was unprecedented for someone of my junior rank to be given a high-ranking medal like that. It was around that time that media reports coming out of both academic journals and the national news media were consistently negative about suicide rates and about family members and active duty reservists not getting access to treatment. For me, the turning point was hearing congressional testimony of DoD officials steadfastly denying that we had any crisis whatsoever, and that we were essentially providing the best quality care in our history, which is patently false. I felt like I was morally complicit if I sat still and didn't do anything. So I decided I was going to contact the Inspector General office with the grievance about essentially medical malpractice due to negligence of the mental health issues. After I filed the complaint, I was receiving emails that I was a Benedict Arnold and I was doing a disservice to the military by even talking about mental health crises when our leaders were denying it. They didn't want to hear anymore. The report was that I was to stay in my lane and to stop speaking out about mental health needs. We're reinventing the wheel every generation at a great, tremendous loss of resources and a great expense, right? Human level and financial level. And we need not do that. But who's responsible for that? Who's responsible to make that reform, to make those transformative changes? These transformations are the lessons of war trauma that every generation has documented since World War I. This is what everybody says we should have done, we should do better, but we don't do it. Now, the idea of a class action came about because in 2003, the Ministry of Defense, which is the United Kingdom's equivalent of DOD, was sued in a class action by British soldiers who were denied adequate mental health care. As a result, the MOD took action. They changed their policy on deployments and the amount of combat exposure. They also provide definitive treatment before people are separated from the military. And they have a very aggressive anti-stigma program. And all that came about because of the class action.
The smoking gun is the Institute for Medicine, who says that after 7 years after the DoD task force report, they say, what the fuck? Why is this still a problem?
We're asking for very specific policies, changes that come right out of the language of all the studies that have been done. We're not creating something that's being imposed on the military.
Own studies.
It's their own studies. We're just saying that we need to actually follow through on these recommendations that have been repeated study after study, year after year,
and that's
generation
the good
after
news
generation.
legally, is that when you have actual there are cases that say that when the government isn't following its own regulations,
That's
that
right.
they're quite vulnerable. So this is slightly different, but it's close enough. These studies are analogous, and we can make a very convincing argument that this case should be handled in the same way that other cases have been, which have been decided favorably. And so, we really have a reasonably good shot at getting somewhere with this. And this case could end up in the Supreme Court, which would be really, really a very good thing.